Thank you, Mr. Acting Deputy President. It's great to rise on this topic because I suppose one of the good things about coming here or being new here, one, you don't know what's going on half the time, and I got caught short there a little bit, getting called up. But two, it wasn't that long ago I was out in the real world, so to speak, and involved in real world issues rather than just talking about real world issues. Just before I came to the Senate, I worked for a beef company, and that beef company, we actually negotiated coal seam gas licences, and we were negotiating with the coal seam gas company about some water use. And I want to just say a little bit about my experiences doing that, because a lot of this debate is driven by things that come second or third hand to people that we can't really understand what people's experiences are. I've of course, both in that role, in that business role, and in this role in the Senate, been to see both the coal seam gas companies and farmers impacted by coal seam gas, but we cannot ourselves actually put ourselves in people's shoes. My experience with the coal seam gas industry is not a completely positive one, but it's not a completely negative one either. First of all, there are, of course, protections in the laws of Queensland and all states about that regulate the coal seam gas industry, so they have obligations to make good, to try to come to an agreement with landowners before they operate. In this case, an agreement was made between the company and the coal seam gas company for 24 wells. While it wasn't an outcome that was particularly attractive to the company, it was done on a voluntary basis. I have to say the most difficult thing in negotiating on these issues is the pure imbalance that exists between the rights of landowners and the rights of the coal seam gas companies. That's what makes it difficult in this environment. If it was simply a business deal where you negotiate an agreement to sell oranges or buy apples, you could see a situation where people walk away with mutual benefit. When you come to most business deals, unless you have mutual benefit, you'll walk away from the table and there'll be no deal. But in this case, you don't have that situation because, at least in Queensland, the law prescribes that if you don't reach an agreement after 40 business days, sorry, I think it was increased to 50 business days in the last few years, 50 business days, you have to let the company on your land, and a court will determine what the rate of compensation would be. So earlier in the debate, Senator Williams mentioned that both AGL, I think he mentioned, and Santos have assured him that they won't go onto people's lands without their approval. And that's what they tell me too, but the reality is when a farmer sits down or a landowner sits down and thinks about, well, should I take this to court, should I oppose this coming onto my property, they don't have a lot of leverage, because after that the clock's ticking. After that 50 business days, they get to come on the land. And so normally, it is in their best interest to reach an agreement within that 50-day window, so they don't have to go to court, so they don't have to pay legal fees, and they can get something rather than maybe nothing. That imbalance makes it difficult, and it does tilt the balance towards those that want to extract gas against those that may want other priorities and have other issues. And I do think a lot of the heat in this debate, a lot of the issues that exist in the debate could be resolved if we simply gave landowners more of a say on what happens on their land. We on this side of politics believe in private property rights. We believe that people should have a say in what happens to their property that they own. And in this instance, there are people who have bought land and maybe have passed that down through generations. They should have a right to have a decent say about what happens on their property. Now, that right is not inviolable. It is not a fundamental human right in the sense that it can't ever be abrogated by the state, because if you live in the city, sometimes you might have to sell your house if the government's put a road through it. Sometimes there's a public good where you have to have your property compulsorily acquired, but that should be the exception, and they should be exceptional circumstances when it happens. And I'm not quite sure these circumstances exist in this case. As Senator Williams said earlier, that we actually had a system in this country where the mineral rights were owned by the landowners. A lot of people on the other side of the debate will say it's a state resource, the state owns it, and the state should have the right to regulate and benefit from it. Well, that's actually not always been the case. And it hasn't been that case for much shorter time than people realise. In the case of New South Wales, it was actually Neville Wrang that took people's or landowners' rights away from them in the 1981 Coal Acquisition Act. 1981. It was after I was born. Sorry, about the same time I was born. 1981 Coal Acquisition Act, that took the rights of landowners off for the right to own the coal and to say what happened to that coal and to benefit from that coal, away from farmers and landowners, and vested them in the state to sell to mining companies and to extract royalties from. That decision happened with no compensation to landowners, none at all. It was simply a bill of parliament. And later on, the Greiner government was elected and they instituted a process to give some compensation to landowners because it was a huge issue in regional New South Wales, as you can imagine. In Queensland, it did happen a lot earlier. It happened in 1915. In 1915, I can't remember the name of the act, but I remember getting it from the Queensland Parliament, and it was a 2-page bill or an act, and it basically just said all petroleum and gas previously vested in private hands is now vested in the Crown. That was it, done. Taken away from them. No compensation, no remuneration, and those rights were taken away. Now, we're nearly 100 years on from that. We are, I suppose, this year, 100 years on from that act in Queensland. So we've had a century of government ownership and control over petroleum and gas resources, and I recognise that we're not going to go back to the pre-1915 situation where landowners actually own the petroleum and gas. Unfortunately, that ship has sailed. But I do think we can rebalance the rights that exist, and I do think that would help this issue. And why do I think that? Because we have very similar issues here in coal seam gases exist in the shale gas industry in the United States. Sometimes they're conflated. They're actually different technologies and use and access different parts of the water table. But they have very similar issues, and they are very different than typical mining operations. Typical coal mining or underground or open-cut coal mining will typically come in and buy the properties that are directly affected. They'll just buy them up. And the people that get bought out usually laugh their way all the way to the bank. I know the former member for New England, he sold some of his property there to Whitehaven Coal and made a substantial profit, probably 3 times, some reports suggest, than the average market value at the time that was going for that land. Great deal if you can get it, and fantastic for those people. But coal seam gas and shale gas is very different because the companies don't buy the land. They just want an easement or an access to the land to drill some wells and maintain 24/7 access to the property for safety and their industrial needs. And that means there has to be an ongoing relationship between the company and the landowner, and that creates tension and that creates issues. There is no one-off transaction. It's difficult for a coal seam or a shale gas company to pay royalties to the state and overcompensate the landowners because they deal with hundreds of landowners, not just a few. So we have a situation where it's hard to take the politics out of this issue. It's hard to resolve the appropriate rights and property rights of landowners and also our desire to develop our resources and create jobs in regional areas. Now, in the United States, they have a very different system. Most states in the United States, the farmers still own the gas. They still own the shale gas. They still own the oil, and they are developing their industry at a great speed and much faster than us. They are restarting and rebooting their economy based on cheap energy and large scales of cheap gas that are close to their areas of industrial development. And it's a great thing for the world economy because it's helping prop us all up at the moment that the US is now back on track, so to speak. Their unemployment rate's lower than ours now, and their economic growth is high, and a lot of that is to do with the fact they have cheap gas and cheap power. And they're developing that because I don't think we should be surprised that when we allow people to make money from something, they'll sign up. When we allow people to negotiate a good price for access to their land, they'll sign up and they'll develop their property. It's something that should be at the core on this side of politics. What we believe in. We believe in that. We believe that if through the private negotiation of rights and services and provision of goods, we will have more wealth created in the economy, and that's what's happening in the United States. A couple of years ago, I was talking to a BHP executive, an Australian executive, but BHP have a lot of shale gas licences in the United States. And he was in Louisiana, and in a suburb of Louisiana, where there was a gas hub terminal, shale gas, in the middle of the suburb, with houses all around, just like a suburb in Australia, and all these pipes were going under houses. And of course, as an Australian, he said to the Yanks, "Well, how did you achieve this? If we'd tried this in Australia, we'd have no hope. We'd have no hope." And the Americans said, "Well, actually, the suburb next door is not happy with us because the gas price has fallen, and we're not going to go in to that suburb now." All those houses around that area, all those mums and dads, just suburban homes, not farms, were getting a cheque. They're getting a cheque from the gas company because they owned the gas under their house. Just a backyard with a clothesline and normal barbecue at the back. They owned the gas under their land, so they had the right to get a cheque from it, and they all supported it. They all supported it, and that's boosting their economy now. But we don't have that situation here. We have a system where the state owns the gas. It's a communist outcome. It's a communist situation where the state owns the resource. It's a national resource, and it's exactly what the Labor Party like. It's not what they want. That's not what we want. Sorry, it's what they want. They want a communist outcome. And what are we getting? We're getting a communist solution to a communist situation. We're getting no production. We're getting lines of industrial companies like bread lines in the Soviet Union waiting and lining up for gas because we can't get cheap gas for our industry. We should not be surprised. It didn't work. It didn't work in Russia, guys. It doesn't work in Korea. It doesn't work in Cuba, and it doesn't work in our gas industry here in Australia. Surprise, surprise. But I do actually applaud the Greens because normally I associate the Greens with communism. Normally I'd think that sorry, Senator Sullivan. It's actually the second time this week I've given some credit to the Greens. You'll have to watch me, but they typically, I think, like the communist outcomes where the state owns the means of production and we all regulate what people do and say and earn in our lives. But yes, that's right. And sometimes we're a little bit socialist too, Senator Carr. That's true. Sometimes, just sometimes, but not in this situation. Because I applaud the Greens because they're calling for more rights to landowners, and I think that's a good thing. And so do the Victorian Nationals as well. They have adopted a policy since the state election of ensuring that landowners have the right to say no to coal seam gas extraction on their property, and I applaud that. It's a good policy. It's something we should see more around the country. And I'll put on record I support that. But what I don't support in coming to this particular motion we're debating today is in section B of that motion, says calls on the government to do certain things, and presumably that means the Commonwealth government. And I think we should act with great caution and trepidation in making laws in this place to cover the whole country on an issue which is well within and very clearly defined within the remit of the state government under our constitution. They are tackling a very difficult issue. It's a wicked issue. It's hard to balance the needs of the state government for revenue and royalties, regional areas for development, and obviously landowners for their property rights. And we certainly don't have a mortgage in this place on good policy. And I think we have seen many examples in the last decade where the Commonwealth government has tried to come in and say, we know the best way, we know what we should do, and we've ended up creating a lot more problems than we were there to start with. There is plenty of opportunity for state governments and state politicians and state election campaigns to deal with these issues. And if there are members of the Senate here that feel so passionately about this issue, well, they should have got elected to a state parliament. They should have stood for a state parliament and a state seat and be progressing those issues in the appropriate place. Now, that doesn't stop us, of course, from expressing support or opposition to certain state policies, as I've done here today, but it's not on. Should be the responsibility of the Commonwealth Executive Government to deal with this. And I particularly think a Royal Commission, which is item B, look, potentially the Commonwealth Government could have a role in doing that. But I did listen to Senator Lazarus's contribution earlier, and while I'm, like Senator Williams said earlier, very concerned with some of the evidence he produced, I have been to these areas, to Tara, to Miles and to Chinchilla, and I'm not sure the evidence is quite there yet to support a Royal Commission into these issues. We've had a Senate inquiry and only a few years ago, and Senator Mackenzie mentioned that earlier. And while some of that evidence was also presented to that committee, we did not make a recommendation for a Royal Commission, and most of the recommendations from that report dealt particularly with dealing with the environmental issues that arise in this industry, and making sure that the Commonwealth Government has appropriate regulatory and oversight arrangements in place to deal with those issues. And I thought those recommendations were largely on the mark, and while they weren't adopted in specific form by the then Labor Green government, they did lead to the establishment of the Independent Expert Scientific Committee and a water trigger under the EPBC Act. So that has led to greater oversight for the environmental concerns. And as Senator McKenzie before, no party actually called for a complete blanket ban on coal seam gas in that inquiry, including the Greens, who wrote additional comments. And the Nationals Party made some additional comments through Senator Fiona Nash and Senator Bridget McKenzie. Sorry, not Senator Bridget McKenzie, Senator Barnaby Joyce, then Senator Barnaby Joyce. They were the only party to actually recommend greater return go back to the landowners, and a recommendation they made that's saying maybe 1%. 1% should go back from the wellhead revenue to landowners. A very moderate recommendation. But we've looked into this issue. The Commonwealth Government has increased its regulations. It has a system set up in place now for additional research and evaluation of coal seam gas applications. I don't actually think since then, since we've established the water trigger, I don't believe any coal seam gas extraction projects have been approved. I might be wrong on that, but I don't believe so. We have 3 projects in Queensland approved, and I believe all of those were done in late 2010, I thought, before the water trigger came in place. There's another project seeking approval at the moment in the scenic rim area of Queensland, but it has not been approved, and there's some others in New South Wales as well. So I don't see the need at this stage for any larger consideration of this issue by the Commonwealth Government. It seems we have increased our oversight and regulation. It is appropriate. While I've spent my time talking mainly on the issues for landowners and property rights, as you'd expect me to do as a Nationals Party senator, I don't shy away from the fact there are very large environmental issues here. The water resource is a public good, and we have a public responsibility to ensure it's not damaged. That's why we have the Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act. That's why the state governments have their own environmental laws. I just want to finish with the point that sometimes I feel the Greens are a great supporter of the Environmental Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act, and it is supported by all parties in this Senate, but they often don't want to support the decisions of the umpire under that Act. That it's one thing to support the provision of the Act, but when a decision comes under that Act, like to approve coal seam gas projects or to approve projects in the Galilee Basin, when decisions come under that Act that don't agree with what they like, they want to take it to the courts and disagree. Well, if you want to pick an umpire and you want to play a game of footy and you pick somebody to decide on the rules, you don't then disagree with the decisions that are made because of those rules. But we have passed this law. The law delegates the responsibility to the Minister, Senator Waters, and the Greens signed up to that. The Greens have signed up to that. They've signed up to the Minister having the responsibility to make those. But you have not opposed it. You've amended it many times, Senator Waters, and the Minister has the responsibility. You voted for the water trigger. You voted for the water trigger, and the water trigger creates the ministerial delegation of power to do that. And we should support the umpire in this case. There's a ream of environmental regulation and oversight that occurs in this country. These projects go through enormous amounts of checks and balances before they're approved, and we are very lucky to live in a country like that. But as I said, Mr. Acting Deputy President, I don't believe there's a need for any greater action from the Commonwealth Government at this stage, but I do support efforts at a state level to give more property rights to landowners.